You understand there are political relationships of varying quality in international relations. And there are cases where Gulf states, for example, may have backed one faction against another faction in a regional conflict for their own strategic interests, like in Sudan, for example, or before that in Syria. But these are indigenous conflicts. You understand me? Not externally engineered conflicts. The RSF in Sudan has been around for 30 years. They were created by the Sudanese government, not by anyone outside. The RSF is not a GCC or UAE proxy militia created by, armed by, funded by the UAE or by anyone else. No. They're not funded and they weren't armed by anyone but the government of Sudan. These are not Emirati mercenaries, please. Please try to be a serious grown-up person. Be an adult. Be honest. At least try. Look, the RSF controls most of the artisanal mines in Sudan, the small artisanal mines in Sudan, which account for roughly 90% of Sudan's gold. That's much of that is under RSF control. That's Sudani gold mines owned by, controlled by Sudanese. They smuggled that gold out to markets across Africa, and they smuggle the gold into the UAE and they sell it to traders there illegally. They sell it illegally. You understand? The UAE does not profit from black market gold. So you're talking about Sudani mine owners, Sudani smugglers, and mostly Sudani traders. That is not the UAE funding the RSF. That is the RSF funding itself through the mines and through the smuggling routes that they control, and through the gold traders that they have in their own networks. See, you want to act like the RSF, which is a completely indigenous militia, a completely participating in a completely indigenous conflict. You're trying to say that that's equivalent to American death squads in Guatemala or El Salvador or Nicaragua. No, you're dishonest. You're dishonest. I mean, to whatever extent this country or that country, GCC or any other country, to whatever extent they take a position on this or that conflict in another country, that's just called statecraft, and it's completely normal. They're not creating the conflict. They're not generating the conflict. They're taking a position on a conflict that already exists, that's already taking place. That is not imperialism by any definition. And the gap between what the word actually describes, what imperialism actually describes, and what it is being applied to, understand that that gap is not a mistake. That gap is your entire argument. Because that gap is the thing that is being smuggled past you while you're trying to process the emotional weight of the word. You understand me? Imperialism as a mechanism, as a system, it produces dependency as its intended and designed output. Dependency in the colonized country. It produces underdevelopment by design. It produces a population that cannot function without the imperial power, because the imperial power has deliberately and ruthlessly dismantled everything that would ever allow for that country to function independently. That is imperialism. Now, Gulf engagement in the Horn of Africa, even at its most self-interested, even at its messiest, even at its most clumsy, even where it might deserve legitimate criticism, doesn't have any of those features. It doesn't have any of those features. So like I said, just one layer of dishonesty is that you are falsely accusing them, the GCC countries, of imperialism. And another is that by doing so, by accusing them of that, you are minimizing what imperialism actually is and what it always has been. And then this creates a very distorted version of reality in which the absolutely peculiar, the absolutely extreme, and frankly bizarre severity of Western imperialism is now equated to normal statecraft, which then allows you to pretend that there was nothing peculiar or extreme or bizarre about it or severe about it. Because everyone does it. The GCC is doing it. Because you use the same word for two completely different things. You put both in the same category, like saying a poodle and a bloody-jawed wolf are the same because they're both dogs. That's how dishonest this is. You're saying the GCC is no better than the West. The Arabs are just like the European colonizers. You understand? That's like saying a peacock and a vulture are the same just because they're both birds. Do you see the dishonesty? Can you understand the dishonesty? Again, that's just one layer. There's multiple other layers. That's just one layer. Another thing that word does, and this is where it gets structurally dishonest is that you're smuggling in a conclusion as if it was a premise. When you say imperialists, you begin with imperialists. You're not saying it as a question, right? There's no inquiry here. You skipped that part. You skipped the inquiry part. You skipped the research part. You skipped any sort of actual rational assessment. You're not saying, let's examine the nature of GCC engagement in the Horn of Africa, and let's assess to what extent it is exploitative and to what extent there's mutual benefit for the countries that they are engaging with. Are they building local capacity, or are they undermining local capacity? Are they just extracting? Are they respecting sovereignty? Are they undermining sovereignty? No, you don't go through any of that. You've already decided. The word answers the question before you ever ask the question. The word imperialist. You assign it the word imperialist. So you don't want to have a conversation that begins from a real inquiry. You want a conversation that begins from the point of agreement with your conclusion. Okay, that's not an honest discussion. That's a propaganda technique.